Aditya. Aditya Raj.
Yes. Yes.
Aditya, Muradabad. You're from Muradabad?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Muradabad.
And you did your BTech mechanical from DTU.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right. So, Aditya, it says you like to write blogs.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, last blog you wrote, and what was the topic?
Sir, it was on the theme of success and failures. I wrote a Hindi poem contemplating my own failures in the past. Mm-hmm. So the theme was success and failures.
Okay, so can you recite it? What did you say?
Sure, sir. With your permission, sir, it's in Hindi, so I'll be reciting the Hindi poem. Yes, sir. तो कविता का शीर्षक है तूफान और लहरें, भाग 1/2। निकल पड़े थे तट छोड़कर, टापू छूने की आस पकड़कर, ना थमेंगे ना रुकेंगे, साथ जो ना मिलेगा लहरों का, तो हौसले के चप्पू से आगे बढ़ेंगे। मध्यस्थ पहुंचकर हुआ सामना आंधियों से, अराजक और अंधकार भरे बादलों से। सरकशी की एक धुंध सी थी, जब वह हटी तो देखा ना तट था, ना टापू और ना ही लहरें। एक अजीब सी सतह पुरसुकुता थी, मानो जैसे कि सब थम सा गया हो, परंतु भीतर पनपते तूफान का सैलाब भी संगीन हो गया। कुछ डर था थमे रहकर इस तूफान की वुसअत में खो जाने का, कुछ बेचैनी इस बढ़ते विरोधाभास की वहशत से उभर जाने की, और कुछ बेताबी उस टापू को पाने की। इन चिल्लाते सन्नाटों में चित्त के किसी खाने से एक आवाज उठी, अंधकार की आंधी में मानो जैसे कि एक लौ जली। अपने भीतर देखा तो हौसला आहें भरते हुए कह रहा था, ये तूफान तो महज एक शराब है, तुझे परखने का उसका बिछाया हुआ एक जाल है। Thank you.
Okay. So mechanical engineering, and
yes.
So when did you decide you wanted to prepare?
So it was mainly during the latter half of my college. I was involved in some some extracurricular activities and societies, and I also got in touch with few of my seniors who were preparing for the same and who are now in the services. So the impression that I got, and also from reading from my own research, I got interested and interacted to prepare for civil services.
Okay. You're from Muradabad?
Yes.
Okay. So tell me something special about Muradabad.
So there are a couple of things. Firstly, it's the brass capital of the country. Mm-hmm. So the brass industry is very prominent over here. Mm-hmm. Second, there are a few Muradabadi food delicacies which are famous, like Muradabadi biryani is famous. Muradabadi dal is also quite famous. So
how is it different?
The biryani, sir? So it's less spicy in terms of the number of spices that are used in comparison to Hyderabadi biryani. Although on the chili side, it's in the higher notch. Also, the rice that is used is also, I think the steaming process is with more oil than other type of biryanis.
Okay. So, which river passes through Muradabad?
So it's the Ramganga River.
Okay.
It's a tributary of Ganga River which passes.
Okay. Moving ahead, mechanical engineering.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What's the first law of thermodynamics?
So first law talks about, just a second, so I'll recall, I'm getting confused among the three laws. First law, sorry, sir, I cannot recall the first law at the moment. Like it's there, okay, but I'm not able to just recall it.
Okay. What's a Carnot cycle?
So Carnot cycle is in reference to refrigeration and air conditioning. If on the graphical sense, if I have to explain it, it's a PV curve with two adiabatic processes and two isothermal processes. And it talks about how the refrigeration...
What's the adiabatic process?
So it's the process where the entropy of a system does not change.
And what about the isothermal? Isothermal? You mentioned the both, right?
So yes, sir. So the isothermal process is the one where the temperature remains constant.
Okay. You would have studied refrigeration, right?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain the process?
Yes, sir. In refrigeration, sir, mainly there is a coolant which is inside like an air conditioner if we talk about it, and the system attracts the heated air or the hot air from the enclosed channel, like a room. And then when it passes through that coolant, through the pipes, it gets cooled up and the temperature gets lowered down. And the same air gets thrown back into the room, while the hot air from the exhaust is passed down to the external setting or the atmosphere.
Okay, moving ahead. Let's assume you are made the DC of Moradabad.
Yes, sir.
What would you do?
So, in generic terms, I think 2 to 3 things. One is about increasing the accessibility of governance or the government officials to the people, which is to be improved. Second is, I think, on the education front, sort of improvement can be made, because if we see the national and even the state statistics, Moradabad is lagging behind in those terms. And thirdly, so pollution has also been a problem in the recent past in Moradabad. So few steps for that also.
Ma'am.
Ma'am, do you want to go ahead? Okay. So Aditya, your optional is political science and international relations. Right.
Yes,
it's one of those very, very dynamic options. Why the switch from engineering towards this particular optional?
Well, while I was making the choice, even mechanical engineering was in the consideration, but I had a fascination towards international relations and politics from long. And frankly, I did not used to get the whole perspective of international politics. So it was my own inquisitivity that drawn me towards understanding the whole scenario in like in holistic sense.
So in the activities that you indulged in, you've also written that you've been a part of the Model United Nations.
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
So even though it happens at a much, much amateur level, what were some of those key lessons in diplomacy, negotiation that you really took from your experience at the MUN?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, in terms of diplomacy, like a couple of things that comes to my mind is like in MUN, and also depends upon what country you are getting. So like hypothetically, if
what was your country?
Mine once was Bangladesh, other one was Slovenia. Like
Right.
in the initial start, you do not get countries, prominent P5 countries for that matter. But in terms of
Bangladesh is a very, very interesting country. So let's
Yes,
have a rerun of it, right? So
Right.
now
Yes,
we know South Asia is going through rather tumultuous times, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You have two neighbors, right? You have, so as India, if you were representing India in Model United Nations, you have Nepal on your Himalayan border, which is going through a forex crisis. You have Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean, which is going through another economic slump, right? What would your reaction? India is already taking a number of steps, right? What would be certain steps that you would take as a part of, say, the Model United Nations to carry forward this conversation? Because this puts entire subcontinent at a risk, right? So what would be your main foundational points of carrying forward this relationship with the two of your neighbors?
Yes, ma'am. And the first and the foremost would be to indulge and contain or continuously contain the dialogue amongst the countries, because we have seen in the past, whenever there is a crisis in another country, due to the communication gap or so, it happens that an anti-India sentiment develops in those countries. So indulging in at all the levels and opening all sorts of communication, right from...
Give me 5 economic-oriented measures that you would take towards Sri Lanka. One, you can take a hint from whatever India is doing towards them already. And what would you do towards Nepal?
First, as India has already taken almost 1.5 billion lines of credit approach towards Sri Lanka. So that would be the first. Second, second would be to look in the sectors where India can increase its import from Sri Lanka, because there has been a decline of exports from Sri Lanka given the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So,
but do you think, given that both India and Sri Lanka, right, when you look at the kind of exports that both these countries have, do you think they're complementary to each other, or do you think there's something that both of them are competing in similar areas?
Definitely. Given the geographies, there is a sense of
what are the chief exports of Sri Lanka?
As I can recall, tea is one of the major ones. And apart from it, fisheries is another major export that Sri Lanka does. Two are the ones that I can
fisheries is a huge topic of issue, right, between India and Sri Lanka, right? So what is that area which is of confrontation between the two?
Ma'am, it's the passing of international sea waters by the respective.
What is that particular area that I'm referring to? Just the name.
Kachativu Islands.
And the area where the fisheries happen, fishing?
The Gulf of Mannar.
Yes, Gulf of Mannar and Park Bay, right? So one step that you could take to resolve the issue of Park Bay, right? Because there are a number of times when India's fishermen are sometimes even killed by the coastal and navy guard of Sri Lanka. So to tackle this issue, right, what would be certain steps that you would go ahead and India can have a conversation with Sri Lanka about it?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, a mutual treaty of assistance or understanding on like an MOU to be signed that if and when by chance like an Indian crosses that line, so the approach that the Sri Lankan authorities and the Marine Police Force adopt should be that of a conciliatory one rather than prosecution one to start.
So what about the environment? What happens to the fish? Are there enough fish for mutual cooperation to go ahead? Is there enough for a sum-sum game between Sri Lanka and India?
Ma'am, obviously, because if we talk about that particular geography, there will be a competition in terms of marine resources as well. So given that kind of like competition, there could be instances where like the actions of the other one might seem to be a little heightened. And if the number of cases are more frequent, then it appears to be an issue for either side.
Right.
So,
okay. So
I think
that's okay. We'll move ahead. So MUN has been such a huge matter of interest, right? But when you look at international organizations, particularly UN, and when you look at recent contemporary global events, be it Syria, be it Yemen, be it the Ukraine crisis, have international organizations like UN been able to respond and tackle these crises appropriately? Right? What are the main reasons for their failures that you can point out?
Right. Ma'am, there has been a concern and I think like there's a more call for wanting more from the international organizations to be more effective in these areas, because we have seen that their role has been very limited and selective also in those terms. The main areas of concern, I think, the first is the legitimacy and the mandate of these international organizations is a concern, and both go hand in hand, because the mandate comes from legitimacy, and legitimacy happens if there is good mandate. So a toothless type kind of a situation first. Second would be the reforms that are required at multiple levels, specifically if we talk about UN, right from the UNSC reforms to the reforms even in the UNGA to the level of even bringing terminology changes in the charter of the UN. And third would be also the funding crunch which the UN is facing in various bodies, especially after the funds cut by the United States of America in the previous presidency. So those three, I think, are the issues which, if reformed, can bring back the legitimacy of the international organizations like UN.
Okay. So you hail from Moradabad, right? You hail from the state of Uttar Pradesh, where the dance of democracy is held, right?
Yes.
So two things that are amazing about Uttar Pradesh is obviously the entire demography of Uttar Pradesh, the kind of diversity that you see there, but also the kind of secularism and the way in which that it's come to be practiced. Right now, being a student of political science, firstly, I need you to elucidate what is India's idea of secularism and how do you see it working on the ground, right? And the context should be where you hail from, the ground realities there.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, India's idea of secularism is that of a very organic and a bottom-up approach with all encompassing views of secularism, rather than a very restrictive or a state-led secularism, as we have seen like in France. So India's secularism.
So you're stating India and French secularism are similar.
Ma'am, they're different.
They're
because
different.
France, yes, ma'am. They are,
Okay.
because India allows that kind of freedom, religious freedoms in various aspects. While in recent past, we have seen France has restricted those kinds of civil liberties to different religions.
So France has
In terms of
restricted
section.
civil liberties more than India has
Yes, ma'am.
in religious
In my-
connotation.
In my limited understanding, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yes. And the ground reality, the practice of secularism.
Ma'am, if we talk at the societal level and given the huge population of both Uttar Pradesh and India, I think the record is phenomenally good. Yes, we see certain kinds of rifts on accounts of communal clashes and even on other aspects. But I think for such a large society and with the kind of law and order capacity that the state has, the societal secular feeling in the mindset of the people are really actually very good. But ma'am, at a time, like many times it happens that either a particular issue or by few community leaders, the issues get picked up and they become a larger issue of communal face-off, or which tends to hurt the secular fabric of the society in Uttar Pradesh as well.
Right. Now imagine you're the DC, right? You've been made the DC, and there is, a community event or a festival which is impending, and tensions are high in the society, and there have been incidents of clashes between the minority and majority community as well. What would be certain measures that you would take to ensure that the situation does not turn violent, while also ensuring the safety and security of the minority community in the area?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, firstly, although, because I feel firstly, keeping the security forces on high alert, it might seem a very preemptive step, but I think from an administrator point of view, securing law and order situation is the foremost priority. So like contacting the local SP and the security forces on high alert, because that also creates a kind of deterrence in the society to not create any kind of nuisance for that matter. First would be that, because that will prevent further clashes if they happen in the future. Secondly, ma'am, also contacting the renowned personalities or the leaders or the celebrities of the community who are participating in that event, because in any future exigencies, those leaders can be the one who can have a say and have an impact or social influence over the people who can eventually become a mob in those kind of scenarios. And ma'am, thirdly, also to it could be like, given the degree of sensitivity of the issue and security of the minority as far as it is concerned, ma'am, I think the presence of officials like me and all those others who can have a very like a perceptual change in that by the presence, by the
what happens if you invite a community leader and instead of dousing tensions, he goes ahead, gives a very, very, inciting speech and further worsens the matter? What happens then?
Right. Ma'am, in that case, considering that the speech has already been made, I think a fire extinguishing approach is what needs to be adopted at the first go, because we have to start with the short-term measures, and only then we can think of long-term measures like say creating a kind of a memorandum of procedure where we ensure that such kind of speeches are at least proofread or are not made in the future. So in the short run or the immediate run, I think controlling the situation again by deploying.
Can you proofread a local MLA's speech? Can you tell your MLA, I'm going to proofread your speech?
Ma'am, apologies. That was it's a nuanced way or a naive way of my understanding.
I get a sitting MLA. Imagine there's someone who's contesting who's still not won. Can you tell? Okay, I'm going to proofread. Technically, unko to shayad aap bol bhi pao.
Ma'am, yes, I stand corrected, ma'am. We might not be able to tell, but ma'am, in my humble opinion, I think just before making the speech, even if a government official can give a kind of a directive, so it might not change, but the tone and tenor can be modulated by the politicians, because it does have an impact if a local official tells something in good faith to a politician to not undertake certain words or certain speech.
Okay, UP recently witnessed your state elections, right? what were three major learnings, right? Three major learnings about your state and the way that it votes that you could arrive at after the elections?
Well, the first understanding was, and that was because I read a report that while a dynasty politics might have acquired a negative connotation, but dynasty politicians are still going ahead and winning the elections. So the perception of politics being dynastic is different from politicians being elected who are coming from the political family backgrounds. One is that. Second, ma'am, on the developmental aspect, there has been a considerable shift where the people and the electoral voting behavior has shifted towards thinking of the developmental markers before making a voting choice. Because previously we have seen in a state like UP, it was mainly the identity markers like caste and religion which used to dominate, but the developmental markers as to how people have got their schemes benefited, or a kind of development that have happened at the personal level has come into play. And these are the two that I can prominently think of right now.
There was a recent report that came out, right? It's a report that comes out every year on democracy across the world. And India's position has fallen further, right? If you can just talk about certain reasons why there is a global perception that India as a democracy is in decline.
Yes, ma'am. Surely, ma'am, I'll talk about the reasons, but I would have to say here that democracy in India, I think we have to look even from our own perspective, because in my humble opinion, it's strengthening day by day. We might see
from global perception, what are the reasons that the report is highlighting, right? What are the markers on which the report says that these markers, these are the places where India is witnessing a fall, and therefore we have reduced India's marks, right? So you can just talk about those reasons.
2 to 3 markers which tend to get highlighted. First is the violence on the journalism and restrictions on free media, which might appear from the global perspective. And yes, there have been cases where deaths of few reporters and journalists have been recorded in the past. Second is a few hate speeches that have been recorded again in various instances at places. Third could be on the political violence that we saw after the Bengal elections. So that could be a reason which might have been picked up by the global report organizations.
Right. Now, moving on, we say India's foreign policy is changing, right? If you can tell me, say, 3 points of departure where India and its foreign policy has switched from what it used to be, say, till the start of Modi government.
Yes, ma'am. The first would be a very strong, nimble-footed diplomacy, which we are adopting, the kind of relations, close-knitted relations that we are having with the great powers. And it's all across the board, the kind of relations with US, Russia, and all others. So that is one, because otherwise we have seen a kind of resistance. Second is the kind of de-hyphenation policy that we have adopted. We have seen it in the Israel-Palestine issue, and even like having a relations with all the West Asian countries, irrespective of the political beliefs and the domestic concerns. Third would be, ma'am, the tapping up of the soft power credentials of India, which was a very big potential, but which have increased in the recent years. The International Yoga Day was a big thing, and apart from it, even small things like the Parliament of Indian Origins, which was organized by India. So, ma'am, these 3 are the clear-cut markers which have made Indian foreign policy depart in the recent years from what it used to be.
Right. You see that India has become a part of Quad, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, despite the violence that we are witnessing in Europe, India has been rather hesitant to openly comment regarding the same or even vote on the same. Do you think in the near future, India is going to be able to balance the kind of relationship that it wants to have with USA vis-a-vis the kind of friendship that it wants to continue to maintain with Russia?
In times of war, it actually becomes very it becomes crucial, but it also becomes difficult to balance your diplomacy because it's a tightrope walking. Given the abstentions that it has made in the UN, and also, I think the stand that India is taking is that of adopting a very humanitarian approach in that regard, because given the war dynamics, it is not very clear to pinpoint someone while the war is going on. Yes, India has called for an independent investigation as far as the Bucha killings or the massacre is concerned. But apart from that, to jump to the conclusions while the war is on would be a little premature for India to do so. And ma'am, I think it also shows the strategic autonomy and its belief in non-alignment and multi-alignment policy. Going ahead, ma'am, India has time and again.
You mentioned humanitarian approach, right? Is India doing anything for the refugees in Ukraine?
Ma'am, the humanitarian aid that is being sent is one aspect of the humanitarian approach that is being taken. Ma'am, even calling back of our Indian nationals from Ukraine, if we see it from one perspective, it's also a humanitarian gesture. Although, yes, it was a national interest.
Towards your own citizens?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Well, because the kind of, I was actually listening to the lecture of, like the speech by External Affairs Minister, Honorable Dr. S. Jayant Deshmukh, and he was saying the kind of environment and the kind of diplomacy efforts that have gone in calling back. Because if we see, it is kind of the lives saved of those 22,000 Indians that have come back. So it's also a humanitarian gesture in one aspect.
Right. Now, just one last question to go. Going back to the same first question that we had, both in terms of the forex crisis that is being witnessed in Sri Lanka and Nepal, right? What does India do to ensure that China does not encircle both of these countries within its grips? Because given China's economic prowess, it is much, much more than India, right? So how does India counter China in two of these closest neighbors, at least geography, that India has?
2 to 3 things come to my mind. One is, again, by opening up channels of communication and conveying the message, because that is of prime importance to convey the kind of debt trap policy. I'm sure the people on the other side of the border are aware of it, but coming it from another country in a serious regard does have its own seriousness. Second would be to take the route of the multilateral organizations or the regional organizations at our disposal, like the SARC or the binge organizations, through which we can adopt policies like a free trade agreement or a motor vehicles agreement, which would attract these countries to have economic relations with the South Asian neighbors rather than with China. Because somewhere deep down,
but SARC has been redundant for so long. What do you think? What kind of steps can SARC take now that suddenly it'll, awaken from its sleep and carry forward all the agreements that have been in pipeline for way too long now?
True, ma'am. But during the COVID crisis times, we have seen that despite the dormancy, there was a summit level organization summit level meeting that was organized even for the SARC grouping. And I think that was one of those markers that we see that in times of crisis and in times of urgency, even these groupings can come out to be fruitful, irrespective of whether there is a kind of there is a non-cooperation by a particular member like Pakistan or not. And we have made these sister organizations like BIMSTEC and others so that we can move ahead on the agenda if SARC is not providing the results for the same.
If you want.
Yeah. Aditya, nothing. I just want to ask you, your father is into business? Like, yes, instead of being into the comfort zone, you opted for this exam. What inspired you?
Ma'am, I think apart from my own understanding and exposure, it was also my father's encouragement to me to look out for my own options, to my own aspirations and whatever I wanted to become. And that has been since the childhood, like whatever stream that I wanted to take. So when I conveyed to my father that I'm leaning towards preparing for civil services, my whole family's approach and encouragement was a lot for me to continue for the same process. So that has been a big motivator and consistently been so.
Good.
for now.
And just one more thing, like you are from Moradabad, and what will you be doing for this petty businessman?
Yes, ma'am.
How will you encourage them to go out and go in for the exhibitions and profit bearing jo hai business? How will you encourage them?
Right.
What scheme would you opt for this?
Ma'am, it could be a 2 to 3 step process. The first will be to ensure that whatever schemes the state and the central government have already implemented for the district, like the one district, one product scheme, is very effective in that regard. Especially the metal craft industry and the petty businessmen of Moradabad can avail a lot of benefits in terms of the summits that are being organized, even for them to portray their skills and their products. Second would be, ma'am, to retain the local artisans, because there have been concerns that the artisans of the metal craft industry and the brass industries are leaving the industry because there's not much profits. So that can be retained so that the basic fundamental art or the craft is not lost in the medium to long term. And then thirdly is the formalization of the economy in Moradabad, if that can happen, because most of the times you have seen that the small and especially the micro enterprises are not are not under the tax net and under the formal schemes of the economy. So formalizing them and bringing them under the organized sector approach can help to bring the sheen back of the small enterprises in Moradabad.
Yeah, thank you.